As the first snow falls, a skilled hunter faces a challenge that will test more than just his strength. He must protect the tribe's food from the ever-encroaching wolves. The ancient wisdom of survival, passed down through generations, is his only hope. Before we begin, share where you're watching from. And if you believe that ancient wisdom still guides us today, subscribe, because tomorrow's story goes deeper into the legends of survival. The first flakes of snow began to fall on the land as the sun sank low behind the jagged peaks of the distant mountains. A chill swept across the plains, signaling the arrival of winter. It was only the first day of the season, but the winds carried the promise of something far worse, an unforgiving cold that would not relent until the thaw of spring. The tribe's camp lay nestled at the edge of the forest, the scattered smoke from the cooking fires rising into the gray sky. Lone Wolf, a man whose hands had crafted many tools and whose heart had known the wilderness like few others, stood watching the horizon. The wind tugged at the fur-lined collar of his cloak, but he felt no warmth. His thoughts were focused on what he had to do, a task that would demand all his strength and wisdom. He had been born into a world that had taught him the art of survival, but even the most experienced could not predict the severity of the coming winter. The wolves were already moving closer, their eerie howls cutting through the silence like an omen. The earth had been kind during the harvest. The summer months had blessed the tribe with enough food to fill their stores: corn, dried meat, berries, and roots. But this bounty would mean nothing if the cold claimed it. The wolves, too, had been preparing for winter, and they would not hesitate to take what was not properly protected. Their sharp noses would sniff out any weakness, any exposed food, and they would come in the night, circling the camp and waiting for the moment to strike. Lone Wolf knew this well. He had heard the stories of the old ones, of those who had lived through winters harsher than even the elders remembered. They had learned how to keep their food safe, to outsmart the predators and the elements. The old ways were not just stories. They were a way of life, a lifeline passed down through generations. And now it was his turn to carry that knowledge forward. As the sun disappeared and the night settled in, the wolves' howls grew louder. He could hear the unmistakable sound of their paws crunching in the snow, circling the outskirts of the camp. The wolves knew something that many did not. They knew that food was scarce, and they would not relent until they had claimed what they could. Lone Wolf knew what needed to be done. The earth had provided everything they needed, but now it was time to use it in a way that would keep the tribe safe. The burial pit, a simple yet powerful tool, would protect their food, hidden away from the keen noses of the wolves. It was a technique learned from his ancestors, one that would require patience, skill, and respect for the land. The wolves were getting closer, and he needed to act fast. The moon hung high, casting a silver glow over the snowy plains as Lone Wolf moved with quiet determination through the cold. His footsteps barely left a mark on the frozen ground as he walked to the edge of the camp. The wolves were still nearby, their howls now distant but persistent, a reminder that the winter would not be kind. But tonight, Lone Wolf was not afraid. He knelt by the creek, his eyes scanning the landscape. His breath formed clouds of mist in the frigid air. The land was not just a place to hunt or gather, it was a living, breathing entity that understood both the dangers and the beauty of survival. Lone Wolf had learned this from the elders, those who had lived through winters far harsher than those of his time. They had taught him how to read the land, how to understand its rhythms and its secrets. The stories of his ancestors filled his mind as he examined the snow-packed earth. They had buried their food in the winter to protect it from animals, but also from the cold that could spoil even the most carefully stored provisions. The ground was a powerful force, holding its own mysteries. If you knew how to work with it, the earth would give you what you needed: shelter, food, and protection. Lone Wolf had been taught to dig only in places where the earth held the most promise. It was not just about digging a hole, it was about choosing the right spot, the spot where the food would be kept safe from the elements and the animals that roamed in search of it. He stood and surveyed the land, his gaze steady as he looked for a place where the wind wouldn't reach, where the snow wouldn't drift in and bury his work. He had learned long ago that survival required more than strength. It required respect. Respect for the land, for the animals, for the seasons. The earth would not yield to those who took from it recklessly. It would only give to those who understood its ways and worked in harmony with it. As Lone Wolf walked farther into the woods, he felt the earth beneath his feet shift with a quiet energy. The land spoke to him, not in words, but in the rustling of leaves and the whisper of the wind through the trees. The ground here was soft, yet firm, a place where food could be buried and preserved through the harshest of winters. He knew this was the spot. He would begin his work tomorrow, before the wolves grew bolder. Lone Wolf stood still for a moment, his hands resting on the trunk of a nearby tree. He closed his eyes and let the earth's energy fill him. It was a reminder of the deep bond between his people and the land. They were not conquerors here, they were stewards. The land would provide, but only if they honored its wisdom. The wolves' howls came again, closer this time. But Lone Wolf felt no fear. Tomorrow, the food would be safe. The first light of dawn barely touched the frozen earth as Lone Wolf gathered his tools. The cold wind stung his face as he moved silently through the camp, careful not to wake the others. Today, he would begin the task that would ensure the tribe's survival through the long winter ahead. Lone Wolf paused by the storage baskets, each filled with the fruits of the harvest. He had spent the past months gathering, hunting, and drying the food, knowing that it would be essential when the snow covered the plains and the wolves grew hungry. Now, it was time to protect it. The task ahead would be long and difficult, but he had no choice. His people were depending on him. He carried the baskets with practiced ease to the spot he had chosen the night before, the ground still marked with the imprint of his feet. The wind had picked up, and the snow swirled around him, but Lone Wolf paid it no mind. His hands were steady as he began to dig into the earth, carefully, carving out the pit where the food would be hidden. The work was slow. Each shovelful of dirt moved with patience. His muscles ached with the effort, but he pressed on. The ground was still frozen, but not as hard as it would be when the deepest part of winter came. He had to dig quickly, but he also had to be precise. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. The wolves were watching, and the earth would only protect them if they treated it with respect. The pit had to be deep enough that even the sharp noses of the wolves couldn't reach the food. It had to be wide enough to hold everything they had gathered. A careful balance between the tribe's needs and the land's ability to keep the food safe. The storage pit was a simple design, but it required careful thought and skill to ensure its success. As he worked, Lone Wolf thought about the lessons of the past. He remembered his father's words, "The land is a teacher. It shows us the way, but we must listen." He had learned these lessons well. The pit would not only keep the food safe from the wolves, it would also preserve it from the cold, the very thing that could render their harvest useless. The food had to be insulated, protected, and buried in such a way that it would remain fresh through the worst of the season. Once the pit was deep enough, he began to layer the food carefully inside. The dried meat went in first, followed by the corn, the roots, and the berries. Each item was placed with reverence, a quiet acknowledgement of the earth's generosity. He covered the pit with layers of branches, then soil, and finally a thick blanket of snow to keep the wind from reaching it. Lone Wolf stood for a moment, looking at the pit. The wolves would not find the food here. The earth had been kind, and now it would keep what they had gathered safe. As the last light of day faded and the cold night began to set in, Lone Wolf made his way back to the camp. The wolves were still close, their howls echoing through the trees, but he was no longer worried. The harvest was hidden. The tribe would survive. The moon had risen high, casting a pale light over the camp as Lone Wolf stood guard by the fire. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold remained, seeping into the bones of the land. He had buried the food well, hidden it deep within the earth, where the wolves could not reach it. But now, as the wolves' howls echoed through the night, he knew the real test had just begun. The wolves were circling. He could hear them in the distance, their voices calling to each other in a chorus of hunger and patience. They had grown bold in recent days, moving closer to the camp as the cold set in. Lone Wolf could feel their eyes on him, even if he couldn't see them. They were watching, waiting for any weakness, any opportunity to strike. Lone Wolf had spent the night by the fire, His thoughts focused on the safety of the tribe. The others slept soundly, unaware of the predators that prowled just beyond. The firelight. The burial pit was safe for now, but the wolves were persistent. They would not give up easily. He had seen it before: their methodical search, their careful testing of each site, each scent. They would begin by sniffing the air, then moving in a wide arc around the camp, their noses tracing the scent of food. They would circle for hours, testing the strength of their hunger. Lone Wolf knew that a single misstep could lead them to the hidden pit. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the buried food. The wolves had caught it, and now they were moving closer, their paws silent on the snow-covered ground. Lone Wolf could hear their breath, low and steady, as they crept toward the camp. His fingers tightened around the spear at his side. He had learned to trust his instincts, and tonight they told him that the wolves were growing closer with each passing minute. The fire crackled, casting fleeting shadows across the camp. Lone Wolf stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the tree line. He could hear the wolves' movements now, their bodies moving in perfect synchrony. They were close, too close. He thought of the pit, buried deep in the earth. The food was safe for now, but that safety was fragile. Wolves could smell their prey from miles away. The pit had been carefully constructed, but it was not foolproof. It was only a matter of time before they discovered it. Lone Wolf's heart beat steadily as he watched the shadows move in the darkness. The wolves were waiting for him to make a mistake, to let down his guard. He would not allow it. Suddenly, there was a rustling in the underbrush, a sound that was too deliberate to be a passing animal. Lone Wolf's eyes narrowed. The wolves were not far off now. He could hear their low growls, the sound of hunger and frustration. They were closing in. The night was thick with tension as Lone Wolf prepared himself for what was to come. He could not let the wolves find the food, not now, not after all the work and he had put into hiding it. The wind howled through the trees, its voice a constant reminder of the harshness that winter had brought. Lone Wolf sat by the fire, his eyes scanning the snow-covered landscape. It had been weeks since he buried the food, and the wolves had grown more determined. Night after night, they circled the camp, their howls a reminder that they were still searching, still hungry. But Lone Wolf felt no fear. The food was safe, hidden deep within the earth, and the tribe had not gone hungry. Each day he ventured out to check the pit. The snow had settled over it like a blanket, and the earth had held firm. The food remained untouched, safe from the wolves' keen noses. It had been a long winter already, with little sign of it easing, but the tribe had survived. The children played in the snow, their laughter echoing through the camp, and the women worked beside the fire, preparing what little they had left. Despite the cold, despite the looming threat of the wolves, there was a sense of peace. But Lone Wolf knew the danger was never far. The wolves were still out there, their howls carrying through the night. They were growing hungrier, more desperate. He had to remain vigilant. He could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing on his chest, the weight of the tribe's survival resting on the food he had hidden. He could not afford to be careless. One night, as he sat by the fire, his thoughts were interrupted by a noise, a rustling sound from the edge of the camp. He rose silently, his hand reaching for the spear that lay beside him. The wolves had returned, circling closer than ever before. Lone Wolf's heart beat steadily as he moved toward the sound, his eyes scanning the darkness. The wolves were just beyond the firelight, their eyes gleaming in the moonlight. They were close, too close. He could see the pack, their bodies low to the ground, moving with calculated precision. They had found the scent of the food, but they had not yet discovered its hiding place. Lone Wolf did not hesitate. He moved quickly, silently, positioning himself between the wolves and the camp. The pack paused, sensing his presence, but Lone Wolf's focus was unwavering. He had trained for this moment, and he knew exactly what to do. He raised his spear, ready to defend the camp and protect the food that had kept them alive. The wolves hesitated, their hunger and instincts at war. They had come close, but Lone Wolf would not let them cross the line. The pack growled low, their eyes fixed on him, but after a tense moment they turned and vanished into the night, their howls fading in the distance. Lone Wolf stood still, his heart pounding in his chest. The food was safe for now, The wolves had tested him, but they had not succeeded. The tribe had survived another night, another winter storm. And with it, Lone Wolf knew the lesson had been passed down once again. Survival depended on respect for the land, for the animals, and for the wisdom of those who had come before.